Nomi Prins, a senior fellow at Demos, is using her insider knowledge of finance to level a harsh critique of what has happened on Wall Street and in Washington in the years since the economic meltdown reached its climax. The causes of that meltdown and how policymakers should be responding is the subject of her new book, It Takes a Pillage. Prins told an audience at the Economic Policy Institute September 24th that in the years since federal officials took a series of unprecedented crisis actions that amounted to a more than $19 trillion bailout of the financial sector, in crucial ways, we've gone backwards.
Foreclosures are still rising. They're up 15% this quarter, and they're up higher on this year relative to the same period last year. Delinquencies and defaults and the deterioration of credit on banks' books because of consumer problems, but because of the borrowing the banks did on the back of consumer loans and other products, has increased at some banks as much as 56%, to double the amount of money that they had to set aside last year before the crisis. They need to set aside this year for continued deterioration on their balance sheets and in their credit portfolios. Of course, we know, not least because of the wonderful work that EPI does on this, how unemployment has continued to drive up, not just nationally, but in many, many locations that have been also infected by foreclosures. And that's what's going on the individual side. That's what's going on in the general economy. On the banking side, profits are up. Many of the major banks, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Wachovia, which is a newly merged bank that arose out of this crisis, had record profits last quarter. 4 out of 6 of the top banks are on track to give bonuses that will be more this year than they were in 2007 before the crisis. Some have paid back some of the TARP money, the $700 billion package that went with the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, but that is only 4% of all of the bailout and subsidies and money that the government has deployed or made available to the financial and banking system. And of the money that has been paid back, they still have more. So that's kind of what's gone on since the bailout. Finance capital is doing better, banks are doing better, some are hiring, bonuses are up.
But while banks are returning to profitability, Prins warns that the nation's biggest banks are even bigger, and there is no legislation on the books that would prevent them from continuing to make the same high-risk bets that nearly drove the economy into a global depression. Prins says that her book lays out some actions that Washington policymakers ought to take seriously.
Some of the things that I talk about at the end of this book is what to really do. Not tinkering around the edges to sort of talk or even talk about capping bonuses back and forth, because although that's a manifestation of the sort of philosophy, it's really such a tiny part of the problem. And today, even going into it is Thursday, today, with the G20 starting, that was going to be a major agenda item, even, capping bonuses and figuring out how to do that globally. It's an issue, but it's not the main problem. The main problem at the moment is that these banks are still too big. They're bigger than they were. They are too risky. They are now taking risks with government capital, and that all needs to change. And the way to change that is to make the banks smaller. If banks are too big to fail, they shouldn't be. Rather than trying to figure out what to do in case they fail again, which is largely what the conversation about regulation, or some of it has been, which is have them put more capital behind positions and take less risk, which they're not doing. They are taking more risk. So while this conversation is going on, that's not happening. And not necessarily just to regulate the global derivatives markets, because that is important too, but the top 5 banks own 96% of the traffic on the derivatives exchanges that will be part of that regulation effort. So they're going to know a whole lot of what's going on, which is going to enable them to take other types of trading positions, some of which they're thinking about now, some I'm sure of which they will think of after and if any regulations are passed. So therefore we need to really restructure the entire banking system, and the way to do that is to make them smaller. It is not really being discussed right now so much out loud, but I really think that we need to bring about a sort of Glass-Steagall Act of our times. Why? Because it worked.
The Glass-Steagall Act was the Depression-era law that separated retail banking from investment banking and other financial enterprises. The repeal of Glass-Steagall in the 1980s opened the way for today's highly integrated global financial giants. While a new Glass-Steagall is not being seriously considered by the Obama administration or Congress, Heather Booth, the Director of Americans for Financial Reform, says that there are some legislative changes being considered that deserve and need grassroots support.
The first is the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, so that there should be a watchdog. Like there is a Food and Drug Administration or Consumer Protection Agency, there should be one in the financial arena too. The second is that people should be able to stay in their homes, and we should have an expansion of justice and fairness in that arena with community reinvestment. The third is there should be oversight for all those shadow markets, and the fourth is that if there is a systemic risk regulator about what's happening in the whole economy, it should not be controlled by the banks, as well as related issues of if something is too big to fail, it's probably too big to exist. So there's legislation that's now moving ahead in Congress. The President's introduced a white paper, a broad framework, made this speech on Wall Street. In the House Financial Services Committee, Barney Frank is guiding through a set of bills that will then merge into one unified package with hearings that are going on till about October 9th. And then within the next 2 weeks or so after that, there'll be the markup of the bill, and the legislation will go through the committee and onto the floor. On the Senate side, Chris Dodd is the head of the Senate Banking Committee, and there's been assurances, at least their plan is, that there'll be legislation moving through both houses by the end of the year.
Commentaries by Nomi Prins appear regularly on the Campaign for America's Future website, ourfuture.org, where you can also find regular analysis of the economic recovery and restructuring effort on our blog. This is Isaiah J. Poole for ourfuture.org.